There were separate water fountains, textbooks filled with racial slurs, and career counselors crushing black dreams. These weren't just strict rules. They were weapons of Jim Crow segregation. From hand-me-down books white schools discarded to something at number 1 that could get 6-year-olds arrested, these 20 rules expose how racism poisoned education. Number 20. The Pledge with Eyes Cast Down. Starting at number 20, we have the Pledge of Allegiance with hand over heart and eyes down. This wasn't just about patriotism. Some principals in segregated schools forced black students to bow their heads during the words "One Nation, Indivisible," specifically to prevent what they called uppity eye contact. The irony cuts deep when you realize these children were pledging allegiance to a nation that refused them basic equality. They recited words about liberty and justice while being denied both. The gesture was meant to instill humility, but what it actually taught was the gap between American ideals and American reality. For students who understood this contradiction, every morning pledge became a moment of profound dissonance. Teachers in these schools walked a tightrope, having to enforce these humiliating practices while trying to nurture their students' sense of dignity. The psychological impact of being told to look down while declaring your allegiance cannot be overstated. It was a daily reminder that even in expressions of national unity, segregation found a way to assert itself. Number 19. No snow days for those who walked. At 19, we have the no excuses for white ice days policy. When winter weather made unpaved back roads impassable, white students received snow days because their buses couldn't run. Black students who lived miles away and walked to school received no such consideration. Missing school because you literally couldn't wade through ice and mud on foot resulted in paddling for truancy. The disparity wasn't subtle. Yellow buses would pass black children struggling through the elements, heading to white schools that would eventually close for the day. Meanwhile, black students were expected to arrive on time or face physical punishment. Parents had to choose between sending children into dangerous conditions or accepting that their child would be beaten at school the next day. The weather didn't discriminate, but the school system's response certainly did. Teachers in black schools often knew the injustice of punishing students for circumstances beyond their control, yet they were pressured to maintain attendance standards that white schools didn't have to meet. The policy reinforced that black children's safety mattered less than enforcing discipline. Number 18. Report cards sent to white bosses. Number 18 brings us to report cards hand-delivered to white employers. In rural areas, school principals didn't just send report cards home with students. They mailed them directly to the farm or mill owner who employed the student's parents. Poor academic performance by a child could result in the entire family losing their income. This wasn't about academic accountability. It was about control extending beyond the schoolhouse into every aspect of black family life. Students carried the weight of their family's survival on their report cards. A bad grade in arithmetic wasn't just about needing extra study. It could mean eviction, hunger, and the loss of whatever precarious stability the family had managed to build. The teachers found themselves in ethical dilemmas, knowing that honest assessment could devastate families. Parents couldn't advocate for their children without risking retaliation from employers who now had academic records as additional leverage. The practice turned teachers into unwitting informants and students into hostages of their own education. Children learned that academic struggle had consequences far beyond the classroom. Consequences that could ripple through their entire family structure. Number 17. One cap and gown for everyone. Coming in at 17, we face the reality of no yearbooks and no graduation gowns. School funding went to white institutions first, and black schools received whatever remained, which often meant nothing for commemorative materials. Senior classes wore their Sunday church suits for graduation. Schools kept one cap and gown, which students took turns wearing only for photographs, creating the illusion of a proper ceremony for posterity. This stripped away the ritual marking of achievement that white students took for granted. Students who worked incredibly hard despite underfunded schools, hand-me-down materials, and systematic obstacles received no tangible memento of their accomplishment. Yearbooks serve as memory keepers, documenting friendships, achievements, and the shared experience of those formative years. Without them, black students' school experiences became less documented, less validated, and easier for history to forget. The single shared gown for photos was a performance of normalcy that everyone knew was false. Parents who sacrificed enormously to keep their children in school through graduation couldn't even provide them with the ceremonial trappings that marked the achievement. Number 16. Perform for white visitors on command. At 16, we encounter the white visitor instant performance requirement. When a white school board member appeared at a black school, teachers received no advance notice but were expected to immediately command their students to stand and recite poetry or sing Lift Every Voice and Sing on cue. This wasn't about showcasing education. It was about demonstrating control and performing compliance. Students became props in a show designed to satisfy white officials that black schools were properly managed. The spontaneity requirement meant constant readiness, turning education into potential performance art at any moment. Lift Every Voice and Sing, known as the Black National Anthem, took on complicated meaning when performed as a command for white approval. A song written as an expression of black pride and perseverance became co-opted into a display of subservience. Students learned that their education could be interrupted at any moment to satisfy white oversight, and that their academic work was less important than their ability to perform on demand. The unpredictability created anxiety because excellence in performance became a shield against potential funding cuts or administrative retaliation. Number 15. Silent Lunch, Hungry Seniors. Number 15 brings us to a silent lunch with segregated tables. Students couldn't talk above a whisper during lunch periods. Food trading across grade levels was forbidden. Older boys sat last and received whatever leftovers remained. Speaking above a whisper resulted in standing facing the wall for the remainder of lunch. This turned a potential social respite into another controlled environment. Lunch typically offers students a break from academic rigor, a chance to socialize and develop friendships. Taking away conversation eliminated one of the few spaces for building community. The hierarchical seating that placed older students last and gave them leftovers created food insecurity for those who often needed nutrition most. Growing teenage boys received the least food in a system where resources were already scarce. The rule against food sharing prevented students from helping each other, eliminating communal care practices that could have mitigated unequal distribution. Teachers monitoring lunch periods had to enforce silence instead of allowing natural social development. The policy taught students that every moment of their school day was about control, that even eating was subject to regulations designed to suppress their natural social instincts. Number 14. Shop class meant mop and bucket. At 14, boys faced shop class that functioned as janitorial training. While white boys in vocational programs built birdhouses and learned carpentry, black boys learned to mop, strip wax, and repair broken windows. The curriculum was explicitly designed to prepare them for future employment as maintenance workers and janitors. This wasn't education. It was tracking students into predetermined economic roles based entirely on race. Shop class traditionally taught valuable skills in woodworking, metalwork, and mechanical repair that could lead to skilled trades. Black students were denied access to these skills in favor of learning to service buildings. The message was explicit: your future is cleaning up after others. Students who might have had aptitude for engineering, architecture, or skilled manufacturing never got exposure to those possibilities. The tracking began in middle school, well before students could make informed choices about their own futures. The disparity in shop class curriculum directly translated to lifetime earning potential, as skilled trades paid significantly more than janitorial work. Students learning to repair the school's broken windows were literally maintaining the infrastructure of their own limited opportunities. Number 13. Wool skirts on the running track. Number 13 covers the requirement that girls wear skirts below the knee even during gym class. Bloomers were forbidden as immodest. Girls ran track in wool skirts on red clay fields, resulting in bloody scrapes that school nurses refused to treat. This rule prioritized arbitrary modesty standards over physical safety and athletic development. Girls attempting to participate in physical education while wearing restrictive clothing that caused injury faced an impossible situation. The wool skirts absorbed sweat, caused chafing, and became heavy burdens during exercise. Running track in such attire wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The red clay fields, already inferior to white. Schools maintained tracks became hazards when girls fell in inappropriate athletic wear. The bloody scrapes weren't minor inconveniences, they were wounds that could become infected, especially when school nurses refused treatment. The refusal of medical care added another layer of harm, teaching girls that their physical well-being during athletics didn't matter. This effectively discouraged girls from fully participating in physical education, limiting their athletic development and potentially their physical health. The modesty argument was particularly cruel, given that the real issue was controlling girls' bodies rather than protecting their morality. Number 12. Only the safe black heroes allowed. At 12, we confront the recitation of Negro history in approved versions only. February meant mandatory memorization of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. Mentioning Frederick Douglass's militants resulted in the book being slammed shut and potential punishment. This represented direct censorship of Black history and intellectual freedom. Students learned a sanitized version of their own heritage that emphasized accommodation over resistance. George Washington Carver's scientific achievements were taught, but often framed to emphasize his service to white agricultural interests. Booker T. Washington's advocacy for industrial education was presented without context about debates within the Black community. Frederick Douglass, one of the most important figures in American history, was deemed too dangerous because his writings advocated for resistance and equality rather than patience. Teachers who knew the fuller story had to choose between honest history and keeping their jobs. Students receiving this truncated version learned that their ancestors were primarily inventors and accommodationists, not revolutionaries and freedom fighters. The February timing meant Black history was segregated into 1 month rather than integrated throughout the curriculum. This ghettoization taught students that their history was supplementary rather than central to American history. Number 11. Duck and cover without shelter. Number 11 brings us to duck and cover drills under flimsy tables. Black schools conducted the same Cold War nuclear attack drills as white schools, but their buildings typically had no basement shelters. Teachers whispered to students that if the bomb dropped, they should just pray. The official policy required practicing the duck and cover routine, hiding under desks that everyone knew wouldn't protect against nuclear weapons. The addition of the whispered prayer instruction revealed that teachers and students alike understood the performance was meaningless. White schools often had designated shelters and actual emergency protocols. Black schools had children hiding under desks in buildings that might not survive a strong storm, let alone a nuclear blast. The drills taught students that even in matters of survival during national catastrophe, they were considered disposable. The government wanted them to practice civil defense while providing none of the infrastructure that might actually aid survival. Teachers had to conduct these drills knowing they were offering false comfort to their students. The psychological impact of simulating survival while being told to pray because real protection wasn't available created a specific kind of existential dread. Number 10. Selling chicken dinners for toilet paper. At 10, we examine the fundraise or freeze policy. Black PTAs sold chicken dinners and held rent parties to purchase coal, desks, and even toilet paper. Students who didn't sell enough fundraising tickets stayed after school to count pennies. Basic necessities that should have been provided by school budgets had to be fundraised by communities that had the least resources. Parents working multiple jobs had to organize chicken dinners and rent parties, adding labor to already exhausted lives. Students became salespeople for their own education, responsible for generating the resources that white schools received automatically. The after-school penny counting wasn't just about accounting, it was punishment for failing to extract enough money from impoverished communities. Teachers watched students stay late counting coins that shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. The rent parties represented communal resilience, but also normalized the idea that Black communities should fund their own basic services while their tax dollars went to white schools. Students learned that education wasn't a right guaranteed by the state, but something you had to purchase through endless fundraising. The humiliation of selling tickets door to door while white children received furnished classrooms without effort taught harsh economic lessons. Number 9. Silence means obedience. Number 9 covers the no talking back ever rule. A raised voice or saying "I didn't do it" was labeled insolence. Punishment included writing Bible verses 500 times or scrubbing floors with a toothbrush. This eliminated any possibility of self-defense or explanation. Students couldn't defend themselves against false accusations without being punished more severely than the original infraction would have warranted. The concept of insolence was weaponized to mean any form of self-assertion. Writing Bible verses 500 times was physically exhausting and consumed hours that could have been spent on homework or rest. The religious element added another layer, using scripture as a punishment tool. Scrubbing floors with a toothbrush was deliberately degrading, designed to humiliate as much as to exhaust. Students learned that their voice had no value, that explaining their perspective was unacceptable, and that authority was never to be questioned. This prepared them for a world that would punish Black people for self-advocacy, but it also damaged their sense of self-worth and agency. Teachers who might have wanted to hear students' explanations had to suppress that instinct or risk being seen as too lenient. Number 8. Kitchen scissors and chemical straightening. At 8, we confronted hair checks for neatness that really meant straightness. Girls with tight curls were sent home until they chemically straightened their hair or wore scarves. Boys with natural hair were cropped on the spot with kitchen scissors by school staff. This was an assault on black identity enforced through appearance policing. Natural black hair was deemed inherently unacceptable, requiring chemical alteration or concealment. The requirement that girls straighten their hair or cover it entirely sent the message that their natural appearance was shameful. Chemical straightening processes were expensive, painful, and damaging to hair and scalp. Poor families struggled to afford the treatments, yet girls couldn't attend school without them. Being sent home meant missing education because your hair was naturally textured. Boys subjected to impromptu haircuts with kitchen scissors experienced physical violation and humiliation. The scissors weren't proper barber tools, making the cuts painful and the results deliberately bad. The public nature of these haircuts served as warning to other students about the consequences of appearing too black. Parents sending children to school couldn't protect them from this violation. The psychological impact of learning your natural hair is unacceptable and affects students' self-image for life. Number 7. Yes, sir to every white face. Number 7 brings us to the yes, ma'am. No, sir requirement for any white adult on or off campus. Forgetting the honorific to a passing white teacher, bus driver, or store owner brought immediate punishment at school the next day. This extended school discipline into every interaction in the broader community. Students had no respite from surveillance and no space where they could be children without monitoring. The requirement taught that white adults, regardless of their relationship to the school, held authority over black children everywhere. A slip in the grocery store could result in paddling at school. Store owners, bus drivers, and random white adults could report children for infractions that had nothing to do with education. This created a network of surveillance where every white person was a potential enforcer. Students had to maintain hypervigilance about their speech patterns and manners in all settings, creating chronic stress. Parents couldn't protect their children from punishment based on encounters outside their presence. Teachers became enforcers of community-wide racial etiquette rather than educators. The delayed punishment was particularly cruel because students would go home not knowing if some interaction during the day would result in beating the following morning. White inspectors and collective punishment. At 6, we face uniform inspections by white superintendents. Once monthly, a white official walked through the line checking hems, shoes, and hair. One loose button or scuffed shoe resulted in the entire class losing recess. This collective punishment for individual infractions created resentment among students while teaching that black children would be held accountable for each other's perceived failures. The monthly inspection created dread as it approached. Parents who were already struggling financially had to ensure uniforms met arbitrary standards, or their child would cause punishment for classmates. The white superintendent walking through represented white authority literally examining black children's bodies and clothing for compliance. Students stood in lines like prisoners being evaluated. The standards for passing inspection were often deliberately unclear or impossible for poor families to meet. A scuffed shoe might be the only pair a child owned. A loose button might be the result of hand-me-downs. Punishing the entire class meant students policed each other, destroying solidarity and creating divisions. Children would blame classmates for lost recess rather than blaming the unjust inspection system. Teachers had to prepare students for these inspections rather than teaching, and had to watch as their students were examined and judged. Number 5. Miles to walk while buses passed by. Number 5 covers the requirement to walk to school with no buses. In most counties, yellow school buses served white children only. Black students walked miles in rain, mud, or ice, while buses literally passed them on the road. Being late despite impossible conditions meant straps across the hands. The visual of yellow buses passing children walking in dangerous weather was deliberately cruel. Bus drivers and white students could see black children struggling and did nothing. The distances were often extreme, with students walking 5 or more miles each way. In rural areas, this meant walking along highways without sidewalks or through areas with hostile white residents. The time spent walking reduced time for homework, chores, and sleep. Students waking before dawn to walk miles arrived at school already exhausted. Weather conditions that would close white schools for safety reasons didn't excuse black students. Walking through ice storms or summer heat while watching empty buses pass taught students their safety meant nothing. Parents couldn't drive children to school because they were at work, and many didn't own cars. The punishment for weather-related lateness was especially cruel because students were being beaten for circumstances entirely beyond their control. Number 4. Freezing in coats at your desk. At 4, we examine the no heat after 2 p.m. policy. Many black schools had coal furnaces shut off early to save money. Students sat in coats, shivering while white schools remained warm. Complaining resulted in paddling. This was deliberate discomfort imposed to cut costs on black education. The afternoon shutoff meant students trying to learn were physically uncomfortable and cold. Winter months made this unbearable, with temperatures inside buildings dropping to match outside conditions. Students couldn't concentrate on lessons while shivering. The requirement to wear coats inside demonstrated the conditions were acknowledged but not addressed. Teachers also taught in cold classrooms, unable to maintain optimal learning environments. The paddling for complaints meant students couldn't advocate for their own basic comfort. Parents sending children in coats knew the buildings wouldn't be heated but had no recourse. The message was that black children's comfort and ability to learn were less important than minimal cost savings. The disparity with white schools that remained heated throughout the day was obvious to everyone. Students knew white children learned in warmth while they froze. The physical discomfort affected learning outcomes, as cold students couldn't focus on academics. Number 3. Torn pages and racist scrawls. Number 3 brings us to hand-me-down books only. Textbooks arrived at black schools only after white schools discarded them. Pages were missing, covers torn, and racial slurs were scribbled inside. Writing your name in what the school considered a new book could be punished as vandalism. This systematically disadvantaged black students' education while using materials deemed unfit for white children. Missing pages meant missing information, creating literal gaps in what students could learn. Math books without answer keys, history books without maps, science texts without diagrams became standard. Teachers had to work around missing content, supplementing with handwritten materials or verbal instruction. The racial slurs in used books subjected students to white students' hatred every time they opened a text. Reading hateful words scrawled in your textbook was a daily reminder of contempt. Teachers couldn't afford to be selective about damaged books because there weren't alternatives. Students learned that their education was literally secondhand, that knowledge itself was something white children used first and black children received as refuse. The vandalism punishment for writing your name created absurdity, where students couldn't mark books they would use all year. The compounding effect over years meant students always working with outdated, incomplete information. Number 2. Dream only this small. At 2, we confront the counselors checking dreams at the door. College-bound black students were told to be realistic, that teaching or preaching were their only options. Writing doctor or lawyer on a career form resulted in a trip to the office for correction. This wasn't guidance, it was systematic dream suppression. Counselors who should have encouraged students instead enforced racial limitations. Students showing aptitude for medicine, law, engineering, or other professions were discouraged from pursuing those paths. The message was that aspiring beyond designated roles for black people was unrealistic fantasy rather than achievable goal. Teachers who saw potential in students had to watch counselors crush it. The office trip for writing doctor or lawyer on forms was punishment for ambition. Students learned that dreaming too big was itself an offense. Parents who wanted better for their children were told their aspirations were impractical. The self-fulfilling prophecy worked perfectly because students discouraged from professional paths didn't pursue necessary preparation. The limitation to teaching or preaching, while honorable professions, represented a narrow band of acceptable achievement. Students who might have become surgeons became teachers, not because of lack of ability, but because of systematic discouragement. The lost potential was staggering when multiplied across thousands of students yearly. Number 1. Colored entrance, colored everything. The most shocking rule: we have separate entrances and separate everything. Black students used marked colored doors, stairwells, water fountains, and bathrooms even when sharing a building with white students. Violating the line meant expulsion or arrest. This was apartheid within educational spaces, enforced with legal consequences. The separate entrances meant black students entering through back doors or side doors marked for them. The message before education even began was that black students didn't belong in the main spaces. Water fountains labeled colored and white existed sometimes feet apart, teaching that even drinking water was racially designated. The arrest threat for crossing these lines made the school building itself a minefield of potential legal consequences. Students as young as 6 learned they could be arrested for using the wrong door. The bathroom separation meant that even bodily functions were segregated. The stairwells rule in shared buildings created bizarre traffic patterns where black students took longer routes to avoid white stairwells. Teachers had to enforce these separations, monitoring students' movements to prevent line crossing. The physical marking of colored spaces branded them as inferior. Students used facilities that were often poorly maintained, while white facilities were kept pristine. Parents couldn't protect children from arrest for accidentally using wrongs. Facilities. This ranks at number 1 because it combined legal threats, physical segregation, constant surveillance, potential life-altering consequences for children, and served as the foundational rule from which all other segregation flowed.